So, as with both of my tracks, I started this one with a kick drum, and I just set the tempo to 120 BPM and laid out a few different kick patterns that I thought would work for the track I was making, which was sort of like a TV theme instrumental sort of sounding thing, and I ended up with a fairly simple 4-bar 4/4 kick beat that I chucked in on the Brooklyn kit that Logic uses on their plugins, so it gave me an opportunity to play around with different sounds, but this was the one that I was after in the end. I then began to loop this and eventually come up with a 8-bar loop that I was pretty pleased with, and that I found was a good starting point for adding the rest of the drums, but I decided rather than to use a conventional kit, I would use percussion sounds to make it a bit more unique sounding. So I used some congas and bongos and some tambourine quite low in the mix, but it ended up being sort of the desired sound that I was looking for. Here pictured is Logic's conga performance sound, which I used through a MIDI keyboard and worked absolutely perfectly for the sound I was looking for. And here you see it layered on top. I left it dry for the minute, but eventually I would add some different plugins to give it the sound I was looking for. And I wanted a really sort of wide, open, reverby sound, as if it was being played in a large hall, rather than a synthetic sounding reverb, like a spring reverb plugin that they do. I'd rather sort of a natural room sound for the task I was looking for. As I do with all of my processes, I have changed the velocities to make it less MIDI sounding, if that makes sense, less uniform, and make it sound a bit more natural. So I went through each of the velocities of each note and changed them after I quantized it to make sure everything's in time nicely. You can see here in the channel strip I added 2 EQs, a compressor and a distortion, and the reason I added the second EQ is just to make sure that it had the high end filtered off after the distortion went through, but for some reason I needed to do the first EQ just to make sure it was ready for the distortion and the compressor. But thankfully it was a bit of a tricky sound to manipulate, but it ended up being exactly how I wanted it to sound in the end, so that was lucky. As I mentioned in the PowerPoint for my second track, I said I bust in a tape delay for enhancing the sound of the drums. So I did the exact same thing here. It was a slightly heavier wet signal this time, but it was a quite a noticeable delay this time on the conga, but it gave it the exact rhythmic qualities I wanted, as well as the tonal qualities I was looking for as well. And as you can see, I've twiddled around with a few things like the delay time, and I've filtered out some of the high cut so it will resonate the lower tones, which is more what I'm looking for in this case. And I've turned the feedback up slightly just so it gives it a bit more of a unique sound, and I've just changed the spread a little bit so it pans us slightly more to the right, rather than the delay pans more to the right than the left through that bus signal. But it ends up being sort of just the sound that I was really looking for that track, and hopefully it will become clear when the track is listened to. Regarding bass lines, I was thinking to use an electric bass, but I ended up using a synth bass through Logic's amazing synth plugins. This one is the heavy synth bass one, and it needed a little bit of manipulating, but it ended up being sort of warm, quite fuzzy, quite retro tone that I was quite keen on in the end. And I played around with a few different others, but this ended up being the one that I seemed to warm to the most. And all I did was played a simple repetitive line that was sort of every other phrase repeated itself, and it ended up just being a rather nice 8-bar loop that I could keep going throughout the track until there was a change in the structure. Of course, I went through the same process of adjusting the velocity levels and quantizing it to make sure it was all in time and it didn't sound too unnatural. so I made sure that it sounded blended in with the velocities of the drums as well, and almost overlapped it at points, so hopefully that can be reflected in the track as well. After the bass line determined where this song was really going, I decided to add a couple more tracks, and this really eventually made the track start sounding like a real song rather than just a series of MIDI tracks lumped together. But thankfully the harp synth harp Logic plugin thing was great, alongside the heavy synth bass and the conga and everything, so it managed to fill out the track a lot more. And eventually I decided that it would be probably best to add some sort of ambient synth sounds in as well, so almost bell-like. So I added this Logic's Cosmic Wave synth, and it ended up sounding great over the top of what I got already. So thankfully the track was starting to piece together bit by bit. As you can see on the left, here are all my tracks laid out, and the congas, the synth bass, the soundscapey synth, and the artificial harp. And over the top of all that, as a lead line, I decided, well, since I couldn't use a vocal, I would use a old transistor organ that sounds like those famous Vox Farfisa or Continental organs from the 60s that appeared in all these amazing sight records used by people like Ray Manzarek from The Doors and such. So I thought it would give it that sort of almost eerie retro TV theme sounding thing. And I added in a organ line around the pentatonic scale and the jazz scale, and it seemed to work quite well with what I'd got already, and it started to piece together to sound quite a lot like what I had in my head as a vision for this track, so luckily it worked perfectly. Came to structure in the track, I thought I would add the tracks sort of one by one as the song went on until sort of the intro was over, and then I could get that verse, if you would, line in on the Farfisa sounding transistor organ, and thankfully structuring this song wasn't too hard, as it was a pretty basic structure I had in my head, and then I decided to add a second part in. So my song was recorded in F sharp minor, and I decided to change to the fourth chord position, which was B flat minor, which worked perfectly with the style of the track I was going for. It almost fit the 12-bar blues pattern without the turnaround, so I almost extended the usual chording pattern for a 12-bar blues progression into just the first chord pattern and the fourth one, and I just bounced it back to the first one afterwards, and I was pretty pleased with what I had in mind for this. I wanted it to be a nice basic simple track that was catchy and memorable and kind of unique percussion wise. I don't think it's shown clearly in the photo, but at the bottom of this of all the tracks laid out, there is another track which is a sample from a YouTube video I found, which was thankfully in the same BPM mode as the track I was making, so thankfully I could sample that, and it was a perfect loop for what I was looking for, and it was just some Latin percussion over some sort of light background noises, which worked perfectly for this track as it fit the genre absolutely perfectly. The final mixing process seemed to be quite smooth, as I knew exactly what I wanted in my head. I wanted most of the tracks to be fairly central so it could be punchy, and also reminiscing back to those mono 60s tracks that are ever so central. And I panned a couple of the tracks gently left and right to give it a bit more width, and the Latin percussion and the congos were panned hard left and right, which managed to fill out the track and give it the width I was looking for as well. Ran everything through a bus compressor and had it set to the right sort of threshold, which was perfect for it, and I managed to get things sounding pretty smooth and close to what I had in mind. And eventually, when everything was all pieced together, I was pretty pleased with what I had in mind, and it worked out exactly the same once I'd done everything all the way I'd planned to, and nothing seemed to go wrong this time, as I'd normally have a few problems with equipment failing or sometimes software failing, but thankfully the process was pretty smooth this time, and just dealing with mainly MIDI instruments, I didn't come across many issues at all.